just to get the ball rolling and get us warmed up a bit. John, being a writer, I know you've spoken quite openly in recent months about where the arts are concerned. Like Van Morrison, for example, he's one of the few who've spoken out in the music world in general. And what's a real curiosity to me is that, under normal circumstances, and I'm going to refer to Bono or U2, they usually stick their noses into whatever the current trend is, like notably a few years ago coming out in favour of repealing the Eighth and every other constitutional dismantling referenda. I just find it interesting at the moment that they seem to have remained remarkably silent in defence of the Irish people and what has been done to them.
Yeah, I think they did a bit of PPE distribution there at the beginning and donations of various kinds. I wouldn't have expected them to. Their recent history tells me that they certainly wouldn't be coming out to defend the Irish people.
Yeah.
That they're on the other side, whatever the other side, whatever you decide that how to define that, for sure. And that's kind of what the point I want to talk about later on about the wokeness of this.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you see, this is a very strange thing in one sense, in the sense that having lived the life that I've lived in various sectors in Irish life, in journalism, in theatre, in writing, in all kinds of things, and having mixed with writers and spoken at arts festivals and all that, instinctively, if you had asked me like at the beginning of this or a year before it or a month before it, how is it going to go? I'd say, well, obviously if this kind of thing happened, if you could anticipate it, all of these people would be coming out, and absolutely not. No, we couldn't possibly allow this to happen to our country. This is crazy. And yet there has been a total silence. Van Morrison, from, Belfast, which is part of our country in a certain sense, but he was the only significant person in the arts in Ireland to come out. A few people across in Britain, Ian Brown, Noel Gallagher had some things to say, Eric Clapton, and this is the thing. I mean, this is mind-boggling for me.
Yeah.
There's something else here that we haven't really described yet, and I can't really describe it, to be honest.
Yeah. Can you see the card on the screen there, John? It's from Ian Brown's Twitter page.
No, I can't.
You can't see it. I'll just read it out to you, right? It says, my May tour of Ireland is cancelled as both our islands are currently medical experimental prison camps and we are being held hostage by government for a big pharma. Now, there's a second tweet. That was March 24th. He's a second tweet here, March 17th. All major festival promoters have held talks with SAGE. They're the British equivalent of NEFIT here. Government since early December, planning vaccine proof as condition of entry. Money is their god. Any musician going along with this is a collaborator and a disgrace.
I totally agree with that. That's exactly the rock and roll position, isn't it? I mean, that's what you would have expected from everybody. That's what you expected to be on the front cover of Hot Press. And whatever is left of the magazines in the United Kingdom, I don't know, the NME and all. I don't suppose they exist in any really.
Yeah, it's really amazed me. They've just been. It's like, as you say yourself, it's the artistic community. They're the very ones who consider themselves the rebels. And I suppose like when you're going along with everything the government is saying, then you're probably not a rebel.
Well, you see, at one level as well, Paul. I mean, over the years, in recent times, there has been a kind of a gradual bureaucratization of the artistic area. You have the Arts Council, and they preside over the whole thing, and they have all these administrators, and there's a significant amount of money to be distributed in different ways, and that's used as bait, and in effect, that's used to keep artists quiet. You know, Estona is another one. You know,
Mm-hmm.
like it's not just rock and roll. I mean, it's like writers. Tell me the name of a writer. Like writing is the whole point. You know, the whole point of writing is to write the truth, to reflect the reality. And I actually have written about this myself in the extraordinary thing that actually you can say now with absolute clarity. Like there are certain strains in this whole thing which we could trace back many years, right? And one of them, just to give an example, and I'm not doing this to claim any credit for myself, but there's a strain in this that you could say is the importation into the public realm of what used to happen in the family court system, right?
Yes.
The brutalization of families, the intrusion into the most intimate realms, you know, the dictatorial imposition of, you know, controls and restrictions on the absolutely everyday life of human beings who had merely gone to the court to seek, or were dragged into the court thinking that they were going to get some kind of mediation of their disputes. And these people were found that they were criminalized and treated as criminals, and basically imprisoned within in a certain metaphorical sense, chained.
Mm-hmm.
They were chained in respect of their children, in respect of their family relationships. Now that's kind of what's happened to everybody in this whole episode. Now I was you know, writing about this stuff, family law courts 20 years ago, and getting hammered for it more than 20 years ago, and 25 years ago, many years ago, maybe even 30 years ago, I had a play on in Dublin and in Kilkenny about family law and about, you know, the intrusion of the state. And indeed, it was actually set in 2020, believe it or not, and it was actually about a kind of an apocalyptic situation where there was a threat hanging over the human race. Now, if you want to, you know, to ask yourself this, like, make a list of writers. I won't mention any names, but just make a list of novelists, poets, Irish people, anybody name you want to put down, and ask yourself what you, and indeed go through a bookshop and look through their books and say, is there anything in those books with the slightest hint, the scintilla of a hint of any of this? No, there isn't. There's nothing. There's no strain of anything. And that tells you, you know, like, and that's a worldwide thing. I mean, you have to go into science fiction to find anything remotely resembling. You have to go back to Orwell. You know, you have to look at someone like Philip K. Dick. You know, but the vast generality of writers, you have to ask of them now, what the hell were you writing about? What? You were writing like, what, 3 little novels about what? This is the end of the world as we know it, and you haven't done anything to anticipate it. And now that it's happening, you are hiding under the bed.
Yes.
And taking your 350 quid a week, presumably also from the government. Your bribe, your weekly bribe to keep your mouth shut. Now, that applies right across the board. It applies to musicians, poets, writers, novelists, you name it. I don't know anybody in Ireland other than that who's come out who can be described in that category. So, and ironically, Van Morrison is actually the greatest artist of our time in any medium, without question. You know, his music will live forever, for as long as there are means of playing it. Yes. He is a unique figure in Irish artistic history, in my view. You know, he is in the line from Yeats and Kavanagh, the present, and is the only person really you can say in the present who is of that stature, in my opinion.
Yes.
And he stands because he understands it. And this is an interesting thing about Van. He always insisted that he wasn't an entertainer. You know that? Like, he was always irritated by the idea that people would think he was an entertainer. And you know that thing when when people would clap at his concert and he would stop singing and tell them stop clapping, you know?
Yeah.
And you know, like, he insisted that what he was doing was something else. In other words, he was an artist, and he was reflecting some deeper reality. And that kind of artist you see all over the world. You see like in the communist countries, Miloš, Havel, Solzhenitsyn. Time and time again, the caliber of these people can be measured in their directness in relation to tyranny.
Yes.
And that's absent from Irish culture completely. So it's all bullshit now.
Mm-hmm.
They can have their literary competitions now. They can have their award ceremonies. They can have their novels of the year, their poets of the century. They can have whatever they like, but it's all bullshit.
Yes.
It's meaningless drivel now. It is rendered so by these events and their silence about them.
Yeah. I was thinking about the media earlier today, and I was chatting to my wife a few days ago about it. And I was saying to her that, I'm just looking for it here because I had it written down, that what's interesting to me is that given the circumstances of the last year, surely the potential for, it would be a career-making move, I would imagine, for the story of the century, for some intrepid reporter to strive for winning the Pulitzer Prize or whatever the Irish equivalent of that is, But it's kind of strange to me. It would be like a career-making move, I would imagine, to expose such a scam, if you like, but whatever word you want to use. But it's kind of strange for me that no reporter has actually stepped up to the plate and said, you know what, there's something not right here. I'm going to expose this. Why is that, John?
Well, alongside the word career making, you have to put another similarly hyphenated word, which is career breaking.
Yes.
And I think that's the one you should focus on here, Paul, because clearly what's happening here is not, some random, orchestration or, a coincidental, situation where everybody ended up on the same side through common sense or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Even in any previous situation, in a situation like this, there would always be at least a few dissenters. Even when, the situation was much less dramatic, you had dissenters over swine flu or, SARS and all that. There was always people who would say this is nonsense, and they were right then, and they would have been right now. But they didn't appear this time, because this time it's serious. This time the plight of the media is so bad that the instruction has gone down that there's zero tolerance for any dissent. It's clear. It's quite clear to everybody. And you see, not alone that, but there's other factors. Just as much as you can see it in the silence of people, or the absence of commentary, or indeed the tweets of the so-called journalists who are on Twitter.
You've gone slightly muffled there, John.
The people on
yes, that's good.
The people on Twitter the journalists on Twitter who are, supporting the government's line as if they were like junior ministers or something, absolutely shocking.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that the media is now primarily concerned with information management rather than providing the public with actual news?
That's kind of a way of saying, but I don't think it actually gets the problem. I mean,
yeah.
It certainly doesn't. That's not untrue, but and I'm not sure I can express how grave the problem is, because the problem is not even that what the media has done. The problem is that the media is in existence pretending to be the media when it is something diametrically opposite the media. It has gone from telling the truth or trying to tell the truth. I mean, like journalism always fails in all kinds of ways, or often fails in all kinds of ways. It often has succeeded. But now it has ceased to even try. It has actually flipped its model and has gone from telling the truth, trying to tell the truth, to absolutely telling lies. and determinedly telling lies, and willingly and enthusiastically telling lies. And that's a really serious situation, because it has an added really detrimental effect, which is that it's like, if you have a watchdog, right, and he barks if there's an intruder around your house, you sleep easy at night. And if your watchdog dies, then you're going to be more alert during the night yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you'll actually won't sleep so well, but you'll be safer perhaps because you'll stay alert. But if somebody manages to dope your watchdog and put the dog to sleep,
mm-hmm.
you'll be sleeping easily, but meanwhile the burglars will be downstairs. And that's kind of what's happened. Mm-hmm. That the media agreed to be doped, agreed to be bribed, agreed to do what it was told, while remaining at its post, ostensibly. That's the real crime here, that they stayed at their post while doing the opposite of what their mandate was, of what their sacred mandate was. That is a criminal offence. That is tantamount, in this context, tantamount to treason, and should be punished accordingly, in my view. I mean, I have said it repeatedly, and I say it again, that when this is over, if it is ever over in a way that we can say that our country has been reclaimed for good, then the buildings of the media organisations in Ireland have to be razed to the ground. RTE has to be levelled, and some kind of memorial park built on that site to the people who have died needlessly in the past year. That kind of thing, that's the kind of thinking we would need to rectify, or to begin to rectify what has happened here. Because otherwise we can never have a safe, free society again. Mm-hmm. There's no question whatsoever that the same journalists and editors could be allowed to continue after this if we were intent upon restoring democracy and freedom to our country. You couldn't possibly allow them. You couldn't trust them.
Yes.
It's the same with politicians, obviously. The political parties have to be made illegal organizations, all of them. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's somewhat a fantasy, obviously, because they have the whip hand, literally. And that's the reason for that is because of the power they've had to indoctrinate and entrance the public, who are still largely under that trance, while their lives are being destroyed, their children's freedom has been stolen, their children's lives are being taken, their health is threatened, and their actual physical lives are now under serious threat. I mean, the numbers of people that we're hearing about who are dying after taking the vaccine, after receiving the vaccine, even in the appalling situation that we are in with our media, we're hearing of an extraordinary number of these people.
Yeah, I have incidentally, I just have another on that. I have another Ian Brown tweet on my screen. It says, are you familiar with this American rapper DMX?
Yes.
Who died? He has a tweet here, RIP DMX, murdered by Big Pharma. So it's linked to an article in Daily Post. Apparently he received the COVID vaccine days before a heart attack. Family says no drugs.
Yeah, well, it's a dreadful thing, and this is the consequence. This is why I mean. This is what I mean when I say the media. This is not like just misinformation. Mm-hmm. This is life and death.
Yes.
Journalists need to be made aware of this, that they're in the frame for this. That if you create a situation in which it is possible to kill people with impunity, then you are culpable. You are culpable. There's no escaping it in any moral context. Whatever the law is or does with regard to this, we know what the truth is, and we must keep speaking the truth. Mm-hmm. But I'm absolutely flabbergasted at the in Ireland, virtually nobody, what you might call no person of substance. What I mean now is in terms of public responsibility emerged in the manner, say, of Lord Sumption, who emerged he was retired, but nevertheless he was a very significant figure in British life, a historian and also a Supreme Court judge for a period, and he emerged very bravely and consistently spoke against their various aspects of these. He did himself take the vaccine in the end.
That's right. I saw his interview. He was. It really took me aback. Well, no, it didn't take me aback, but he certainly has a right to take it if he wants. I wouldn't stop anyone taking it. We're all responsible for
Yes.
our own, what goes into our own bodies. But it did surprise me somewhat. Peter Hitchens as well
Yes.
took the vaccine. Now he was kind of saying, that he had the right to take it, but but I think his big beef, or many of these people's big beef, is with their concern is with this idea of a passport or a health certificate, whether one could argue that taking the injectable first is a stepping stone towards the certificate. I don't know, but
yes. Well, I think it's somewhat confusing. I mean, this has been there were over the past year and a bit now. We've seen the various participants in these discussions, and many of these people are to be admired, but not all of them are saying the same things. There are different strands within what they say and don't say. I mean that are important distinctions. And I mean, it's interesting. Both Peter Hitchens and Lord Sumption, quite similar in many respects. That they consistently did not try to go under the question of the why of the virus. Why was this being done? They were agreed that it was completely disproportionate. They were generally speaking about the incompetence or, indeed the tyranny of the government. But they weren't actually analysing it in any broader sense. And they were not questioning any fundamental sense, which, in my view, was open to be questioned. The fact that the virus, that there was serious evidence that whether the virus existed or not was an open question. Mm-hmm. Or whether the virus was anything like what it was being said to be was open to question. Mm-hmm. And that remains the case. The virus has not been isolated. Nobody has produced the evidence that it has. So yet they talk about variants from this virus that has not been isolated. How can you establish a variant if you haven't isolated the original? I don't know how this works, but nevertheless. And then late in the year, it became clear that both Peter Hitchens and Jonathan Sumption were kind of, somewhat, I would say, indifferent to the vaccine question. Mm-hmm. And in the end, they both said they were going to take it. Now, there was I think that there's an element there which is interesting. You see, not everybody kind of has the same view of what's going on, in the sense that they don't see that there are walls being built in relation to this that have different purposes. For example, there's a wall being built culturally in relation to what is called conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. And this is a way of actually preventing access to the discussion by anybody who doesn't buy into the entirety of the narrative. And so it's the term conspiracy theory in itself is very interesting, because it actually creates a kind of a sinister undertone around the very idea of actually questioning the possibility that people might be conspiring here to do nefarious things. Which is a rudimentary function of journalism, by the way, is to actually conduct those theories and those hypotheses. Mm-hmm. And to test them and investigate them. That's what journalism actually is. At its most fundamental level, it's investigating the possibility of conspiracies. And yet journalism is now functioning as a platoon squad of mercenaries seeking to pick off anybody who tries to do this. Mm. Now, that tends to frighten away substantial figures who may very bravely buy into the discussion in a critical way, in a dissenting way, but stop short of going into the why, and stop short of questioning the power behind what's happening. I don't mean the political power. That's a different kind of an argument, where they're talking about competence or some such. But we're talking here about the possibility that there are vested interests, and they don't want to get into that for fear they're going to be closed down on the basis that they're conspiracy theorists. Mm-hmm. And yet it seems to me the central plank of any opposition to this has got to be to identify the vested interests. I mean, you just look at the debate, so-called, not debate, debate's the wrong word, the way that not conversation's the wrong word, the way that, this staged discussion about COVID is run in Ireland. Virtually all the so-called experts have been shown, not by the mainstream media, but online, by online people, as having been massive vested financial interests in vaccines and big pharma and all kinds of things, virtually without exception.
Have you seen there was a video, I think it was on I have it there on my computer. It was Luke O'Neill in the last few days where it was on the News Talk page on YouTube. You can check it, or people can look at it if they want, where he was kind of promoting the injectable for children, essentially. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't. No.
That's the latest from him,
Well, yeah, I mean, he's a profoundly compromised individual. I mean, like in any other context, this would be said every day. And he would have been required to leave the stage a long time since on the basis that he's completely conflicted. And yet he's treated as a completely honest broker, in everything. Mm-hmm. This is part of the corruption. You see, the watchdog has agreed not to bark at those things. And that's essentially what's happened. That's the watchdog is being bought. Like RTE announced that it made a profit last year. Like it did this with a completely straight face. And then in the small print, you see that it actually got 6 million of our money from the government to tell us lies. Mm-hmm. So it made a profit of 5 million, but it got 6 million to the government. So in actual fact, already it made a loss of 1 million. But we've paid 6 million to be lied to. Mm-hmm. And you see that this is something I've been saying for years, that you need with the media, like who watches the watchdog, like who checks on the media. I was working in the Irish Times for years, and for a brief period I was the media correspondent, because I actually took very seriously the role of media in self-policing. And but that was a disastrous situation, because the Irish Times editors did not want a media correspondent to do that, far from it. So I stopped being media correspondent when it became clear that I was wasting my time. And I actually had to give up a staff job in order to stop doing that. But there is no overarching platform which monitors what the media does. And as a result, the media is in effect the Supreme Court of Ireland, because everything is, in a sense, judged in the court of a public opinion, but it's not actually public opinion. Mm-hmm. It's media opinion controlled by whoever pays the bills. And in this case, it's paid for by the government. So the government is actually controlling public opinion.
Mm-hmm. Apparently, the Irish Times now has a view on vaccine passports in the context of a poll. I have it on the screen there. It's from April the 7th, where it's kind of I don't know who the writer is, but it seems to be a collective view of the Irish Times in the matter. It's not attributed to any. The article is talking about. Let me see now.
Probably an editorial, yeah. I mean,
it's
normally that's written by the editor in theory, although it never is. Yeah. But that represents. It's a very strange process. I mean, it doesn't actually represent anybody very often, because what actually happens is the editor or senior editors, when they want a particular editorial written, they contact the person with allegedly the most knowledge about it, and they ask that person to write. They tell the person broadly what they want them to write, but. So it's a very strange process. In theory, theoretically, it's supposed to be the view of the actual editor, which in this case would be the view of Paul O'Neill, but he doesn't have any opinions about anything other than that he wants to get his paycheck into his bank account at the end of every month.
Yeah, it's essentially broadly outlining its supposed views on the vaccine passport and so forth. Like it's saying here, those who cannot receive a vaccine because of disability or medical conditions cannot be excluded or have their movement restricted. And it's going on about then, apps and the PCR tests and so forth, and public transport.
See, again, can I pull you back up there?
Sure,
because You see, the meaning of that sentence is not what it says; it's what it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't say,
Yes.
or what it nods towards, because it's saying that those who have no such excuse can have their movements restricted.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And that's a fascistic position.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the Irish Times runs articles every other day about the far right,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't exist in Ireland other than in the Irish Times itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the most right-wing thing I've heard in this country for a long time. That they're saying, the Irish Times is now saying that people who who are not sick, who don't believe that there's any evidence that this disease is deadly or in any way dangerous to the vast majority of people, who do not, for all kinds of reasons, want to take a medical vaccine that is not tested and for which there is no license of clearance, and for which the pharmaceutical companies have been given a waiver of liability, that those people should be subject, according to the Irish Times, to limitations on their freedoms, which changes the meaning of the word freedom from what it has been held to mean through centuries of democracy, going back to ancient Greece.
It essentially becomes a conditional form of freedom.
But which is not a freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, of course it isn't.
Yeah, so this is what it's come to now, and you see, this is the real depths of the thing, Paul. Now we're into it, really. We're into it here. We're into the dizzying, concepts, and trying to understand how it is possible. I mean, I'll be 66 in next month,
Mm-hmm.
and I've lived in this country, and I've listened carefully to lots and lots of things, and nothing that I've picked up in the last 66 years, or maybe the 60 of it that I've been fairly attuned to anything, has led me to believe that it would be okay to suggest the withdrawal of freedoms in this way, or that anybody of note in the society was disposed in that direction. I think that 5 years ago, anybody who came up with views like that would be compared to Hitler, and rightly so. And yet now we have so-called respectable editors and journalists adding their names, ticking the box for these fascistic measures, while at the same time creating smokescreens about other people, accusing other people who are fighting them and fighting this of being far right. I mean, this is, it's a comedy show at one level, but without any humor.
Like with what we're hearing through the media and directly from the government, in your view, are we dealing with disinformation, which has intent behind it to if you like, misinform, or plain misinformation where people themselves are genuinely deceived rather than deceiving others, if you know what I mean?
I'm not quite sure. You mean in the sense that...
What I mean is that, for example, do you believe... would your view be that people in the government or in the media are deliberately disinforming people, or are they misinforming in the sense that they actually believe themselves and are themselves deceived?
No, I think that they are deceiving. I don't think that they're. I mean, I don't rule out their stupidity. I mean, but. There are enough signs that they know what they're doing. There are enough signs. Time and time again, we've heard them actually speak the truth in a certain kind of, I don't know, diabolical sense, where they actually concede something. For example, we'll have the Radker talking about the way they certify deaths and saying, yeah, well, if somebody dies of a cancer and they haven't been tested for COVID, but they show some symptoms of COVID, well, that's a COVID death. Mm-hmm. And he said that. I mean, he said that quite openly. And in the Dáil, it was said by a member of somebody from the HSE in response to a question by the chairperson of the Oireachtas committee, Michael McNamara. He asked, well, and somewhat satirically, he asked, well, like if somebody falls off a roof and hits the ground and dies, but is taken to hospital and given a test for COVID, and it's a positive, is that, oh yeah, well, that would be a death from COVID, yes. Mm-hmm. That's the answer. This is the level of it. But the interesting thing about that is it seems to be designed precisely in that way to create maximum confusion And the best way I think to articulate it is to kind of put yourself in the situation of the ordinary person listening to this. Now, I don't listen to radio, so I'm hearing all this secondhand, or I'm going looking at it when people really insist. I go and listen to something, I do it. But so the response to that would be, because you see, you tell the lie 99 times and then you tell the truth once, right? And that makes it deniable that you have lied.
Mm-hmm.
Because you just say, well, if you ever go to court, say, but you look, on the 17th of April, 2020, Mr. Radker stood up in the door and he said the following. What do you mean he misled the public? You see, and then you see what actually happens is, well, the ordinary, and I've had this time and time with family members and so on. But you say, well, you know that Radker said that essentially they're falsifying the death figures, but that they're doing it, he said, because why? Well, because we're not interested in league tables. We're interested in saving lives. Now, you riddle me that. Tell me how you can actually save lives by lying. Right, but that's the kind of way they work, you see. So the ordinary person would think, you have a conversation, if there was a pub that you could have a conversation in, it would go something like, well, one fellow would say to the other, my God, I heard Radker there on the radio there, and he was saying that they don't really count. They count anything really as a COVID death now. That's more or less the way it is.
John, has society become obsessed by health? Like, when we have zero sugar Coke, zero fat yogurt, and now some are proclaiming the need for zero COVID.
This is nothing to do with health. This is nothing to do with health whatsoever. Let's get that clear in our heads. There's no connection with health at all. This is health weaponized.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care about your health. They don't care about anybody's health. They don't care about the climate either, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't care less. These are all weaponizing. These is weaponizing issues, blackmailing people. Mm-hmm. But the point I was making there is that, like the ordinary person, which I include myself, if I wasn't actually paying such close attention to this, they think that they hear something, and then because it isn't repeated, because it isn't on the 6 o'clock news as well as the 1 o'clock news, mm-hmm. they think, maybe I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
So it's out there, but it's not out there, and it's like the thing being on page in a small paragraph on page 17 of the newspaper. The paper can say afterwards, well, we did publish the story. What do you mean? It's there. So that's the way this is managed. But you see, it's very important to pay attention to propaganda. Because you see, there's a misunderstanding about propaganda. They think that's simply that you give a one-sided version of things. Well, of course you do that. But the most important aspect of propaganda is that it be ubiquitous. That it isn't, so that it becomes not simply the process, the purveying of information. It is the construction of reality, because it occurs everywhere. And you see, I'll give you an example. I mean, my wife was telling me recently, her mother was reading a magazine. She just picked up a woman's magazine, Woman's Way, or one of those. And my wife looked through it, and she found innumerable references to COVID in it, including in the recipes. And that, you couldn't define propaganda better.
In the recipes?
In the recipes. It's in the recipes, right? There's a reference. I don't know what it was, but it's in the recipes. Now, here's the interesting thing. You see, this is the way it works. That the point is to communicate to you that it isn't that there's a news of coronavirus. There isn't news of a pandemic. The pandemic is reality. The pandemic is banging against your window, and that's why it's got to be everywhere. Otherwise, you think, well, it's a bit, there's something going on out there, or so, there's nothing. That's why you have people then who are under the effect of that. The way they talk to you, the way you kind of, like, I've noticed repeatedly, mm-hmm. people I've known over, casually enough, but, acquaintances who run into it, and they become very edgy if you raise the slightest question about it.
Yes.
Because they've been programmed so perfectly. And they start getting very fidgety.
Yes.
And it's not that they're uncomfortable with what you're saying as such. It's that they actually feel a deep sympathy for you because you are one of those people. Do you understand?
Yeah, I was out for a walk there recently, John, and I know sometimes, you know, the way sometimes when you're talking to certain people about this particular subject, and some people they're just completely closed. There's no changing their mind, or I have my views, they'll have theirs, and sometimes I adopt like for example, I went out for a walk there a few weeks ago in the open air. I live kind of in a rural area. I was walking up, two ladies came walking towards me. One had a mask on, one didn't. And as I was passing, I just stopped and I just said politely, "Look, can I ask you a question?" She said, "Yeah, yeah." And I said, "Can you tell me why you're wearing a mask in the open air?" And her friend kind of started sniggering a bit. It almost indicated they must have had a conversation about it beforehand. And she said to me, she said, "Well, you get the usual answer. There's a pandemic. I don't want to get sick, and all these things." And what I do sometimes is what I said to this particular lady was, I said to her, I said, can I just ask you one more question? I said, can you just just imagine now for the last month or the last 2 months, the last 6 months, 7 months, whatever, just imagine for a moment that you had, for that period of time, you had no contact with the media, you had no contact with the television, with the internet, with any kind of media information. And I said, imagine then in that circumstance that if you looked around you, would you see a genuine pestilence with your own eyes? And I find more often than not, it does throw on a few light bulbs when you ask people questions like that,
Well, I would say yes, it does, but for how long?
Yes.
You see, you're talking about a force field. Propaganda creates a force field.
Yeah. Well, this particular lady was quite. She was one of these individuals that just didn't want to hear anything. Do you know the type of person I mean?
Well, that's the nature of it. You see, because I found this actually in the referendums very much, because if you go back, say, to the marriage referendum, what happened there was really interesting, and it makes a good comparison. Just very briefly, you see, the way that was run was that people were offered a form of absolution for the sin of their homophobia. That was the whole construction.
Mm-hmm.
You were accused, the entire population was essentially accused of being homophobic, which is a completely invented thing. Like, homophobic means hatred of gay. Most people couldn't care less about gays. Mm-hmm. They haven't time to be hating them. They couldn't care less. Mm-hmm. I certainly can't. Mm-hmm. And I'm certainly not afraid of them, which is another aspect of it. But so that they tell people that you're a little bit homophobic. If you reply to them, well, I'm not. I don't think. You see, you're denying it now, and that's another symptom. Like, you see. So what thing was in the deal was then that if you give them everything they want, you will be purged of your homophobia.
Yes.
And you see, when people actually bought that into that deal, and you then came up and say, well, can I talk to you about the Constitution and what the effects of this will be? They begin almost screaming at you because they don't want to hear you. It's like a child saying, when a child, when you don't want to hear, they go, put their hands on their ear and they go, la, 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 la. Mm-hmm. It was like that. And the same thing here with the COVID. They have bought into the idea that they're saving lives, that's the enterprise, because otherwise it's such an appalling vista, because what it means, to paraphrase Lord Denning, is that they have been lied to by everybody they trusted, that the government has lied, that the Oireachtas has lied, that the newspapers have lied, that RTE has lied, that the entire edifice of Irish society is corrupt to the very core and does nothing but lie from morning till night. That is the alternative. And therefore, that is such an appalling vista that they have to tell you, no, I don't want to hear what you have to say, because it's too much. And that's the effect of propaganda. Mm-hmm. It's a thing we don't really understand. And I mean, I've only got to understand it to some extent, and it's a very profound thing, because it's actually, it's to a high degree hypnotic. It's hypnoidal, the process is. It's not a normative communication of information. Mm-hmm. It uses all kinds of tricks to actually to tap into the reptilian brain, which is the innermost, lowest form of the brain that operates emotionally exclusively.
I'm trying to think of that gentleman's name, the ex-KGB. I used a clip in one of my videos recently. I can't think of his name.
Bezmenov.
Bezmenov, that's the guy, Yuri Bezmenov, that's right.
Yeah.
Because he kind of made that clear, really, that once someone has been fully programmed or brainwashed, or whatever term he used, demoralized, that I think the example he used, that if you took them to the camps where people are being murdered, they still wouldn't believe.
Yes. Well, you see, like you think about it, all the literature about the really significant literature about hypnosis or about propaganda is to be found in the first half of the last century, going back to Bernays and all those guys, and Jackie Lowe wrote about it, and there was lots and lots of books about the integration of propaganda with advertising, and the use of deep manipulative strategies and selling things and so on. But all that stuff really kind of didn't. It kind of reached a crescendo through the 50s and 60s, and then it just sort of tailed off. And then you could say that the media really started to be like ubiquitous after that. Like up to that point, there was nothing. There was newspapers, there was radio, there was some TV channels, but it was not everybody had a television. There was hoardings and posters and all that kind of stuff. But it was Mickey Mouse stuff compared to what we have now, which is like 24/7 news, many 10,000 channels on satellite. Internet radio, social media, smartphones, all this stuff. So, like, these people, like 100 years ago, Edward Bernays was able to sort of talk in a really terrifying way about the power of politicians or advertisers to manipulate the minds of the public. What would he make of what we have now? It's unbelievable. I mean, we see essentially what they have the capacity to do is build walls of lies around everybody. Mm-hmm. And you can't get out of those lies. And so therefore that's what you're talking to when you meet somebody. I met a man there recently, a very nice man. I've known him for a very well-known man, and he's a musician, and he's getting on in years now. He looks very well, and he told me after getting his second jab of the vaccine, he said, "No, I know you don't agree with that." And there was no awkwardness between us, but there was that sense of, I don't want to know about it. I don't want to hear you telling me anything more about it. So I don't proselytize about it at all when I'm out in the normal course of it, unless somebody asks me a question, because, but I'm aware of this kind of this attitude or this response. No, it's not an attitude. It's a demeanor that people in this state have towards you, which is that it's almost like oh look, this is the one. He's one of them fellas now that be people that that be talking about an RTE. The conspiracy theorists.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of like my view. I'm always, if someone wants to talk about such a subject, I'm always willing to talk to people, but at the same time, I'm aware of the fact that they have a perfect right not to hear about it as well. So I tend not to.
Yeah,
to push it.
I don't offer gratuitous advice. I mean, to some extent, with the vaccine, I will tentatively say, if they haven't taken it, my advice to you is don't take it. You don't need to take it right now. Mm-hmm. And wait and see. That's something that I would say, because I know of people who tragically have taken the vaccine, and I'm afraid it's not going to end well for them.
Mm-hmm. Like we have a kind of ongoing joke here in the house, my wife, that we kind of say, well, the more people that get it, the better for us. We're taking kind of a wait and see attitude. Neither of us feel we want to take it. I mean, I certainly don't want to take it. My wife doesn't.
There's two ways of seeing that. There's another way, which is that the more the numbers of who haven't taken it diminish, the more they will be scapegoated. That's where I think we're heading.
That's true also, yeah, you're right. You're right.
Because that's the tone of the government. The government is now saying, like Radcliffe's saying, that people will get their freedom back if they take the vaccine. When they take the, of course they won't anyway. But the idea that he thinks he's entitled to say that is so shocking that it makes me numb.
Yes.
To think about it. That this guy, who is he? This upstart, who isn't even Irish, is telling me that I can have my freedom back that my forefathers fought with their blood for.
Yes. John, do you think like people like that, are they transmitting fear because they themselves are fearful and therefore are unable to act as real leaders?
Well, I don't go into that, Paul, because I mean, I don't allow any excuse.
Yes.
If I'm the Taoiseach of Ireland, that is a sacred role.
Mm.
I have one duty, and that's one duty, and that is protect the Irish people from danger.
Yes.
Nothing else. I don't care what the WHO wants or says. I don't care what China says.
Mm.
I don't care about America. I am the Taoiseach of Ireland. If that is my position, that is the greatest honour I can be given. And that is the greatest responsibility I can be given.
Mm.
There's no qualifiers, there's no conditions, there's no excuses.
Yes.
I don't care what pressure somebody's under.
Mm-hmm.
If he's under pressure, come out to the Irish people and say, I can't handle it. I'm sorry, I have to step down. I'm very sorry. We would salute him for that, for at least the dignity of saying he couldn't do it. But this is treason. These people are treasonous. So no, I don't get into that.
Yes. Yeah. No, it was said to me by someone recently that in a discussion, like we were disagreeing, and they were making the point that, let's say the Taoiseach, for example, are people that have voted in that, you know, they're under terrible pressure and they've got to make a difficult decision, and they have, you know, they have to do what they feel is right, and all this kind of stuff. No, I was completely disagreeing with that, but
well, yeah, but it's the same as people who say, well, you know, they're good guards, you know. But okay, I say, well, when are they going to speak out if they're good? When are we going to see evidence of their goodness? They're going to call out the tyranny that their force is now responsible for on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And the abuses that they're responsible for.
John, did you see that Polish pastor in Calgary in Canada when he essentially shouted out the police out of the church?
Yes.
I thought what was very interesting about that was that he just wouldn't. His technique was. He just didn't allow them to speak. He just, you know, I just don't want to hear what you have to say. I'm just not interested in what you have to say. He didn't get into any negotiations with them.
No, that's the way to do it. That's the way to do it. He's speaking with a higher authority, you see.
Yes, I think he grew up in. I think he was born around 1970 in Poland, and I think his family moved to Greece when he was in 1983, and then he ended up emigrating to Canada. I just have a clip here of him. He gave an interview with Mark Stein.
Yeah.
You may be able to hear this here. I'll just give it a quick play.
Of the Soviets, and I'm telling you, that's no fun at all. It was a disaster. Police officers could break into your house 5 a.m. They could beat you up, torture. They could arrest you for no matter what reason they would come up with. There was a famous saying in Poland when I was growing up by the police: "Give me a man, and we will find something on that man." So it was like a flashback when those police officers showed up at my church. Everything kind of came back to life from my childhood. And the only thing I could do is to fend off the wolves as a shepherd. And I used my voice to get rid of them. They were illegally encroaching on our rights during the most holy days, during the Passover celebration. How dare they? The audacity of those people coming. It was a shocking thing. I was a little bit shaken, but I did what every shepherd right now on the planet Earth should be doing: fend off the wolves. We as lions should never bow before the hyenas, and that's what they are right now.
Well, the hyenas are fairly confident in their powers, and a lot of the things that have become accepted in the last year, for example, New York police kicking a woman to the ground because she's not wearing a mask, governors of American states and Canadian provinces telling you whether you're allowed to have your granny or your aunt over for Christmas or Thanksgiving. I mean, that is the kind of tight 24/7 control that most communist countries lived under for half a century from the end of the Second World War. Is it all beginning to look worryingly familiar to you, the way people accept it?
Yes, it is. I have been warning Canadians for the past 16 years that that's what's coming. I could smell it. I could see it at every corner. The implementation of what we are seeing now, it started way about 20 years ago. So growing up under communist dictatorship, I mean, that's a disaster. That's hell on earth. And I see it already in our Western democracies. So the only way I know how to fight them is 1981 that I witnessed millions of Poles taking to the streets and saying to them, no more, get out of our country, get out, stop. Millions of Poles took it to the streets during Solidarity, Lech Wałęsa, and they want their freedom. Right now, if you want your freedom back, because we have to remember, history is teaching us that those people will never give up their new gained powers. You gotta demand those rights back. You have to fight for your rights. They'll never give it back to you freely. So how to do it? Get them out of your properties, out of your businesses, out of your churches. Open up, open the churches. Clergymen should unite and start pushing this darkness away. And we should come and take to the streets and say no more lockdowns, no more restrictions. We will not put up with this anymore. We are fighting back.
What's your reaction to that, John? Oh, he's serious. Oh, Lord. Okay, I didn't realize that. Basically, what he was saying is that people, he referred essentially that he was saying essentially that we are lions and they are hyenas, and that if we want our freedoms, or he was referring to life under communism, where the police could come in at any time, kick down the door, and that if people want their freedoms back, they need to just take it back. They need to go back to, and there's another pastor in Canada said the exact same thing. It was interesting. He was saying the government have just taken over his church now. They've actually surrounded it by fencing. And he was saying people just need to go back to their lives, just, not to be violent, nothing like that. Just go back, take the masks off, go back to your life and live your life. And that'll be the end of it.
Recently, I had this bizarre communication from a professor in a university in America, in one of the American states, and he worked briefly in Trinity College some years ago, but he was sort of offering me to have a discussion or a debate, which I don't have any particular problem. He believes I'm wrong about the whole thing. Now, I didn't go into any much detail. But he had a huge kind of resume of qualifications and all the rest of it, and it's very impressive and all that, But I said, well, I was spotted by. I said, well, what are we going to argue about? So what are we going to argue about? Whether sickness exists, or are we going to argue about whether death is permanent or inevitable or what? And I said, this is about freedom. There's no argument about freedom. There's no two sides about freedom. This is something, and I don't care what your science is. Science is no more entitled to take my freedom than I am entitled to take his. Same goes for doctors. Same goes for politicians. They don't have any right to take my freedom. No guard has a right to stop me on the road to Sligo and ask me where I'm going. None. Now, there's a pragmatic situation where if I say that to the guard, he may be an ignorant asshole. Mm-hmm. And he may drag me out of my car, and as has happened to numerous people over the last year. And that's something I have to take into account to some extent in whatever diplomacy I adopt. But fundamentally, when I hear these people saying that they're going to let us do this I say, go to hell. Go to hell. Mm-hmm. And when the bishops tells me that, the thing, as far as I can, all of the bishops of the Irish Church have resigned, in my mind, in relation to, I don't take any guidance from them anymore because of their behavior in this past year. I saw I listened to your podcast about the church, and I thought it was absolutely beautiful, perfectly pitched, and very kind, although very tough as well. Very kind to them, very Christian, if I may say so. Much more Christian than I am inclined to be with those bastards.
Yeah, I had a follow-up one written. To be honest, I kind of pulled it. I was like, I was kind of saying that, like, some of these individuals, not on the one I released, but in another one that I had written and prepared, but in the end I decided not to. I just didn't bother. Like, essentially, that some of these individuals, and I'm talking about church leaders now, they really need to look themselves in the mirror and question whether they belong in a pulpit at all. And I was kind of saying that, look, maybe it's now time to move out of the way and let someone with a bit of backbone take over, as many of them are just not up to the job. And I think a lot of the problem too is, like a lot, I think it's what happens when the pulpit not only lacks courage but also suffers from a deficiency in intellect and reason. I think in a lot of churches I've seen, especially independent churches, like we have churches that have overdosed on emotion and sentimentality. And these are all the same places that were all silent in concert while the Irish Constitution was being dismantled as well by the state in recent referenda.
That's right. They were. They did nothing. On 3 referendums, they said nothing worth saying. And in fact, in many cases, the only intervention they made was to attack those of us who were saying something. And the same is happening here. I mean, they're now advocating. And in fact, it's criminal that they're using the power of the pulpit to bully their faithful into taking vaccines that may kill them.
Mm-hmm. Churchill once defined an appeaser as one who continually feeds a crocodile in the hope that it will eat him last. Like, isn't this exactly what the Christian churches in Ireland have been doing now for the last year?
Yes. But ultimately, then you have to ask, what's the end game for them? Well, the end game seems to be their own survival and nothing else. Mm-hmm. Survival for what? I mean, this is the thing that, I remember actually during the referendum on abortion, meeting with several bishops, and they were saying, I was sort of, I said, well, when are you going to, we were saying to them, when are you going to come out? And say, well, we're keeping our powder dry, was the answer, Mm-hmm. Repeatedly we heard his face. I said, yeah, what are you keeping your powder dry for? Mm-hmm. What battle are you going to let loose all this powder, huh? Mm-hmm. No battle. They're not interested in battles. This is, I think the implication of this. I've written a piece about this on my John Walters Unchained, and at the core of it is this question, really: which of these unbeliefs do the bishops and priests now subscribe to? One is that an unbelief in COVID. That, in other words, when they were told that last year that 85,000 Irish people would die, most of whom they could have anticipated would be members of their church. And they did nothing. They did nothing to try to ensure that to save the eternal souls of all these people that were going to die. Right? Mm-hmm. They did nothing except close their churches and tell people go get stuffed. Right? More or less. Mm-hmm. So they didn't. Either they didn't believe in COVID, or they did believe in COVID, and they knew that there was no point in giving the last sacraments or the Eucharist or confession to people because they didn't believe in God, and they didn't believe in afterlife, and they didn't believe in the Last Judgment, right?
Yeah.
Now, which is it? Which of the unbeliefs is it? Do you not believe in God, or do you not believe in COVID? Because we really need to do that, or maybe both. I don't know. Like, that's the level we're at. Mm-hmm. And what we're talking about here is a church which has now become really a therapeutic organization in its own mind. That its whole sole function seems to be social work in its own mind and therapy. Yeah. And that's how it justifies its existence, because it doesn't. That most of its practitioners no longer believe in anything. Mm-hmm. That's I see it, and I'm not talking about just the local priest. Like, I'm talking about the Pope. Mm-hmm. So, like, I think that we need to have this conversation, because if that's the situation, then we shouldn't be listening to these people at all.
Yes.
People need to wise up. I mean, it's a very hard lesson to accept. I know, but wouldn't you be better to know it? Wouldn't you be better to know it and to make other arrangements, to start to reframe your thinking at this late stage? I don't know what age, whatever age. I'm 66. Mm-hmm. I've gone through several loops of this now. Mm-hmm. I've been walked away from it before, when I was 19, 20, and then come back in my late 30s and into my 50s. Stayed and went through a terrible series of events where I came to the conclusion in the end that this church, by and large, apart from a tiny minority of good people, was really interested in two things: power and money.
In my experience, in recent years, I'm hearing a lot of Social justice has essentially taken over the pulpit in
Yes.
in some of the churches I've gone to. I remember seeing there was a show on RTE many, I don't know what you call it, many years ago. Could have been 10 years ago. Do you know this guy Mark Little? He did some show at some stage. I remember seeing it where he did a tour of America, and at one stage he stopped off in one of these, let's call them progressive churches, and it was interesting that he was sitting in one of the pews, and the sermon was going on, and the camera was behind him in the pew behind him. So he kind of turned to the camera while the guy was preaching, and he kind of said, I think his words were something along the lines of, there's not so much fire and brimstone, but it's more like a self-help talk.
Yeah.
And it was interesting for me at the time, because I remember thinking to myself, isn't that interesting that someone who's probably not a Christian or not a believer can walk into that church and see that straight away, whereas
Yeah.
all the people sitting in the pew can't see it at all.
Yeah, and I mean, Mark would be on the other side of all the arguments that I'd be involved in. But yeah, I take your point. I know Mark, but he's the storyful guy, and that's got its own story.
Yeah.
But yeah, but then you got to ask that. You use the phrase social justice. Well, what does that mean? Social justice. That's a euphemism.
Yeah.
That means essentially cultural Marxism.
Yes.
And that's what the church is. It's actually, it's and to say that the left-wing organization doesn't get it, because it's not a left-wing organization at all. Because left-wing organization, a socialist organization, would represent working people, ordinary working people. It doesn't do that. It represents the most powerful interests in the world, the globalists, the corporates, the Bill Gateses, the George Soroses. These are the people. That's the kind of doctrine that's coming out of the church now. From every one of them. I mean, there were a few dissenters among the bishops, two, among the bishops up to a couple of years ago. They're pretty much they're now in concert. They're now in harmony together, in unison. But on everything, and very often what they're telling people is actually not the church's teaching. Like the teaching they're teaching, what they're teaching on, for example, mass migration, is not the church's teaching. Nothing like it. This is because the church has actually been sold to the globalists. Francis is the globalist pope. He's not a Catholic at all. I mean, the old joke, is the Pope a Catholic? Well, the answer now is absolutely not.
Yeah.
No, of course he's not. He's taken the church and so on. Now that's so like we make our own arrangements. I mean, God is still out in the heavens, or not, depending on your belief. But in my belief, there is a force that we derive from and that we return to. That's the way I see reality. And I don't need the Pope, right? I don't need any Pope. I don't need any Archbishop of Dublin. I can walk around Dublin if I want to. Not that I want to nowadays. Without knowing there's an archbishop up in Drumcondra. I couldn't care less. I don't need a parish priest. I don't even need a church to go to anymore. My relationship with God is my relationship with God, and I can handle that without any middleman, any gombean man.
Yes.
So,
I think that's the essence of the gospel. Really, it's just having a personal relationship with the Lord.
Now you see, there's another argument, Paul, another aspect of this, which is being part of what I've called my mission in my life, journalistically, in the last 20 years, which I think has to be said is a failure, and that was the idea that whereas yes, of course, we can all find eternal individual salvation by in that way, there is another dimension to this, which is that a culture is a different matter. A religious culture requires a particularized instrument of communicating the eternal and the transcendental, right? And in Irish life, that was the Catholic Church, for good or ill. Now, I'm not naive. I've just said, I can find my own way to God, but you need in a culture to rare. I wouldn't have that if the church had not been here in the first place. Yes. All right. So now the question can well be put to me. Well, what do you plan for what's for the next generation and the generation after that. And I have to admit a difficulty there. And I have to admit a defeat, that I did what I could to try to save the church and to, in Ireland and elsewhere, and to keep the church honest. It went dishonest. It's been a failure. So we have a real problem now. And so therefore, I mean, I think that the situation is wide open in Ireland, you know, for what will happen. You know, and I'm for that reason, you know, I mean, for example, you could actually quite easily see, if anybody who read Michel Houellebecq's novel Submission will be easily persuaded that a society can quickly flip to Islam, even a Western society. It's an entirely plausible story. And it cannot be ruled out, because the Irish people are so fickle now and lacking in any kind of gumption or principle or conviction.
Well, I would see Ireland very much now as a secular country, very much so, post-Christian, I would say.
Well, yeah, well, that's only because it's a fad. They think that's trendy and they think that's clever. That makes them more intelligent than people who go to mass. They think that. But you know, I really would say we're there for just be taken by anybody now. Look at what's happened in the last year. Like, could you have anticipated this? I mean, like, you've got to look around at your neighbors now, don't you, Paul, and say, I didn't know you. My God, I got to keep away from you. You're dangerous. You're my jailer now. You're my jailer. You've got the handcuffs on your belt, and you can snap them on me at any time. That's what you got to think about your neighbor now. That's how bad it is in this country. I wrote for many years, one of the themes I took up many years ago was the whole question of post-colonial influence and effect. And I repeatedly tried to draw attention to the fact, from maybe the mid-90s, around the time of the 150th anniversary of the famines, I tried to raise these questions systematically and to talk to people about the psychic effects, the residual effects of all of this history on them. And I could see it, you know, and I could see it in all kinds of ways. But I had no idea how bad it was. But now in the last year, you can see it. This is it. Ireland is the worst place in the world now to be in this COVID situation, because we have the least bottle, the least courage, the least gumption, the least intelligence. You know,
I'm amazed at how docile the Irish people have become. It really it's really astounded me, John.
Yeah,
when I go to my local shop, I've never worn a mask at any point in time, and no, anytime I've been confronted by it or asked about it in a shop or a store, you know, I just politely put my case forward and politely decline to. If they offer me one, I've always declined it. At one stage, I think it was my local shop there recently. I actually wrote a letter or an email. I sent an email to the manager to explain. Look, I normally don't wear one when I'm in your shop. Here are my reasons, and that was fine, you know. But it's kind of like I was kind of the view that the Church of Climate Control was going to be the new religion here, you know. But I think COVIDism now seems to be giving it a run for its money.
Well, yeah, but you know, they are connected. And that's the point I want to talk about in when I talked about the woke thing.
Yes.
You know, from the very outset, you know, it was clear that COVID kind of seemed to immediately break down ideologically, as if certain kinds of people understood implicitly that it was about something that wasn't stated, you know. So, I mean, the way I put it is, if I was working in the Irish Times, when I was working in the Irish Times 20 years ago and maybe going to the occasional weekly conference to discuss features or whatever news, you know, and there was a pandemic threatened, for the life of me, I couldn't imagine that that the meeting would break down into pro and anti, and that you could actually anticipate the general political outlook of a person on the basis of the position they took on the pandemic. But in this case, you could. That people who were generally in favor of the lockdown and bought into the COVID narrative were people who we would loosely call liberal left. and those who were opposed to it were what our other people call right, what I call common sense.
Yes.
And that you could see that all around the world. You could see that it was people who were resisting, who had resisted the referendums, who were against the COVID, the lockdown thing. So there was, and the way I put it is that it was about fundamentally constitutionalism. And you see, the battle that has been going on secretly for the last, it's not secret in a way, but for the last decade, we've had a battle about the Constitution, more so than we had one about, the marriage and parenting and life and all. They were all parts of their constituent parts, but fundamentally it was about the Constitution's view of human reality. And there was serious move on to change that, to remove that, and to replace it with the establishment's view of human reality. And that's why you see there basically where the courts are now refusing to enforce. This is their opportunity to scrap the Constitution, which most judges want to do. This is why we've taken, myself and Jim O'Doherty have taken our case, is to dramatize and demonstrate this. It's not to win. We'd be shocked to our core if we had any chance. We're happily not winning.
Yeah. What's the current status with that, John? Are you going to the Supreme Court? Is that?
Yes, the next stage.
Okay, that's the next stage. Okay.
Waiting at the moment for the Court of Appeal to finalise its to perfect is the word they use, as if any from a court would be.
I know there are some people I've heard some people online who have argued that yourself and Gemma, they believe anyway. I'm not a legal expert in any way, to be honest. I've only limited court experience, but they've argued that maybe you decide by going the constitutional route that you took it the incorrect way in their view. What
would be the correct way?
Well, I as I said, I'm not in any way a legal expert, but
see, the thing is, Paul, like
what I'm saying, I suppose, like if you're, for example, if you're in court and you say, okay, if I decide to challenge something in court on the constitutional basis, let's say, the court can say, well, this is exceptional circumstances, there's an emergency or whatever. In my mind, I would assume, well, in that case, would it be better to take the approach that, well, the government is claiming there's an emergency, well, challenge them to prove that there's an emergency. Do you know what I'm saying?
That's essentially what we're doing.
Okay. Maybe I misunderstood that. Okay.
But you see, you got to remember, there's a whole lot of people online who are not do all day, only crib about other people.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Do nothing themselves, and most of them are anonymous. Mm-hmm. I've seen something. I didn't watch them, but people who are lawyers critiquing our case without actually, by the way, citing anything significant from it. That's an interesting thing about that. All these critics, they have nothing. They don't ever say what's actually in our case.
Yes,
and that's very interesting. They use lines that the judge may have used, from which were from the floor of the court. And one of them most memorably, and this is actually now at this point, it has become quite comical in a certain sense. The most famous line or the most famous episode in the whole thing, which has been repeated ad nauseum, where the judge accused us of having made an offensive and egregious comparison between the COVID situation and Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah.
Now, the actual nature of the thing was that Gemma O'Doherty was actually speaking on her feet, and she was actually making, as in the course of just making a series of remarks, she gave as one illustration the fact that we were now being required to produce documentation of our identity public for the first time in Irish life, and that this was something that had happened in Nazi Germany. Now, is there anything factually incorrect about that, first of all?
No.
Now we're being told that we can have our freedom back if we can actually have a vaccine passport, which will prove that we have taken a potentially lethal injection. Right? That goes beyond Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany didn't require that in that form, right? Now, so this line has been repeated, but nobody has actually gone in and said, well, now you're talking about the question of the emergency. Well, that was the core point, one of the core points, there are many points in our case, but one of them is in relation to this declaration of a state of emergency, when you can and when you can't do it.
Yes.
This is central to our case. But again, this has been distorted by two judges. I mean, the George Birmingham's Court of Appeal judgment was laughable. Like it's that a serious person can put their name to this gibberish is beyond my imagining. I can't understand it. He must really, I don't know. I'll say no more. I mean, it's just unbelievable when you see what he wrote down. Yeah. You see, so, but the most important thing we said here is that, you know, a year ago, we would have given anything. I certainly would have given anything if somebody, some eminent Lord Sumption type person had stepped out in Irish life and taken this case. Nobody did. So somebody had to, and we did. And now all the people who didn't, who sat in there, are actually sniping away from the undergrowth in order to make themselves feel better about their inaction and their cowardice. That's all that this means. That's all that it is. So I don't really take on board anything they say.
Yeah.
We're going ahead. We have our own understanding of what's happening. We have our own way of dealing with it. We will continue, and at the end of it, we will make a statement to the people and to history about what all this means.
When do you expect to get your hearing in the Supreme Court, John?
I don't know, because I would have expected things seem to have slowed down significant. There's no reason for the delay. I mean, it's been 6 weeks now, I think, since the judgment. We had to put in an application about costs, which went in about a month ago. It's well past time when the judgment maybe would have been finalised. Then we have 4 weeks after that to appeal to the Supreme Court. And so maybe the tactic is they want to delay it so it doesn't come up before the summer, which, you know, it doesn't really matter from the point of view now. It's far too late for the action to have any effect in terms of, you know, stopping. I mean, we did it on the 15th. We're coming up to the anniversary now, the 15th of April last year. If the courts had behaved in a decent way and legal way, lawful way, we could have had the whole thing overturned by the end of April. Yeah. And everything could have been gone back, and the country would have been saved from decades of absolute grief and destruction that is now imminent. So, but they didn't, and that's more criminality. So the people have to, this is part of the lesson that people need to understand. I mean, you know, this is the point. There's a very interesting thing that you can observe in this, where there's an assumption. I've noticed this in my life many times, the same syndrome, where, you know, people go with public opinion. So if somebody's been crucified, they join in and they spit and they kick as you're passing by, as you're, you know, but the problem is history doesn't work like that. From their problem, I mean, the problem is that history changes, history shifts, and what was, you know, a year ago ignominy is now a kind of a silence. That is what I meet now. It's not the spitting in my face and jeering that I got a year ago. Give it another year. You know what I mean? Like that, you have to sit out history. And that's what I said to George Birmingham, the president of the Court of Appeal. You know, he was looking down his nose. I was talking about making a comparison between the emergency of 39 to 45 and the present situation, which was very interesting because, you know, in that time, the World War II, in which 60 million people died, like the country was wide open. There were dances, there were like bingo, there was whist drives, there was all kinds of stuff. You know, the bars were open, like there was theatre. It
was the same in London.
And there were football matches. The All Ireland was played, so he interrupted me in the middle and says, you know, Mr. Walters, this isn't really furthering the matter in any significant manner. You know, and I said, well, Judge, you know, of course we're here, I said, to address the court, and, you know, primarily, yes, but we're also addressing something else. We're addressing history. We're putting on record for history that these matters were raised. So that kind of took the steam out of his soup, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you see, frankly, you see, there's an extraordinary deference in Irish life towards these people, and it needs to stop, because that's at the root of our problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're not actually prepared to stand up.
Yeah.
And what actually happens is that you have this virtue signaling then that people attack you if you do, because they think that that'll gain them some credence from authority.
That was one of my main criticisms in that video I did, the blog on the appeasing churches, was how the churches are just too deferential to government.
Yeah. There's no reason to be. These guys are doing a job. You know, a judge is doing a job. You know, the principle of contempt of court is a very technical thing. It's not about whether you offend the judge. You're quite entitled to offend a judge. The question is, do you respect the process? Now, yes, you do, if the process is respectable. But if it ceases to be, then that's a different question. And Lord Sumption has said as much in relation to the law. He says that there's no moral obligation on citizens to respect bad or stupid or corrupt laws. And there's no doubt about that. And there's no reason to respect corrupt courts. Now, of course, you may have to pay a legal penalty for, you know, upholding your moral right, but that's another matter. And, you know, we're prepared for all that. Like, so, you know, I just, it baffles me, you know, again, it's part of the whole thing. I can't really understand. I can't even believe that some of this stuff went on. That when I was walking down the streets last April, May, June, I was being spat at and shouted at abusively by men on bikes, whizzing past or accelerating before they let go of their payload of expletives in my direction. What's it to them? They're programmed by RTE. That's what's it to them. That's all. It's going back to the propaganda thing. That's that's the level. They think they're expressing some kind of independent-minded, opinion that they've worked out. They haven't. They're just programmed. They're just being Pavlov's dog.
It's interesting, John, how just looking back over the last 12 months now, how nothing can happen in history for 20 to 30 years, and then you can have 20 to 30 years worth of history in just a few months.
Yeah. It's incredible, really. And in some ways, I kind of said this. I mean this in a kind of a slightly double-edged way, that in a certain sense it's a privilege. It's a great privilege to live in interesting times. It's a great privilege to be part of something, because your whole life could go by in dullness.
Yeah.
And that you feel for all the trauma that wars and other historical events bring. They bring a great sense of meaning and vividness to reality, to be part of them. But that implies that you have to do your thing. You have to stand up, however minor your role may be. In the end, you have to do your part.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're moved by in many ways. That our country calls us in this way that we never thought would happen.
Yeah. Sorry, no, I was just thinking there. My parents would have been alive during the Second World War. My wife's grandparents, her grandmother is like 96. She was she was at Krakow airfield when the Stukas were bombing the airfield. Literally, they were coming. She was telling me they were coming so low they were almost touching the flames. So, I mean, they lived through real fear and real hardship.
Yes.
And I was thinking today, like, what would my parents make of all this now? People being afraid of a flu. And it's kind of like historically, like mankind has always lived side by side with all sorts of disease and plagues, and death was commonplace in all groups historically. Nowadays we live longer than any time in history, and I'm just wondering, are we just becoming more and more effeminate as a society, where health is concerned, at least?
Well, we are, but again, I would just say this isn't really anything to do with health. I mean, the health is just the health issue is because that's a wonderful weapon of blackmail. So that's all that has. That's the only significance. But yeah, I mean, there's a huge aspect here to do with men. You know, the failure of men, the collapse of manhood, in the last 30 years, is a striking thing. You know, and I mean that's something. And I mean that's the way I read a lot of that stuff, the abusive stuff. You know, I get it from men mainly, almost.
Yeah.
And that's because they feel guilt and shame, and the only way that they can escape from that is to drive me off the pitch, drive off any man who is doing the things they're too scared to do. Do you understand? That's really what's going on, because men in particular have been totally emasculated by this. Just think about it. Like they've lost the capacity to provide for their families, to protect their families.
Yes.
They've even lost their capacity to take their children to the beach because some vanguard may stop them and turn them back. You know, humiliate the father in front of his own children. This is it's unbelievable and unprecedented.
Yes.
And so this has been going on. See, that's why I say, going back to the kind of, essentially I would say that COVID is a culture of Marxist weapon in a very profound way, because it's linked to all the other elements. And it goes right back to the beginning. And the strange thing about my work as a journalist, I mean, and I don't know, you could say this is random and accidental, but it probably isn't, in the sense that what I did was I followed things that came to my attention. I wasn't necessarily looking for things. I wasn't looking for conspiracies or whatever. But when things happened in my vicinity, I started to write about them. And when I became aware of the family law court corruption, for example, and then I started writing about that, and that brought me into a whole, because then I noticed I was being attacked by feminists, which is a bizarre thing. And then I started to explore that, and I went into other areas like male suicide. How come nobody was talking about that? The difference between the treatment of men's health and women's health, which at the time was much worse than it is now, although it's still pretty, where, you know, there's totally ignoring of prostate cancer and you know, no, fine, everybody's entitled to have their health looked after. But my point is, why was one area being completely ignored? And so on. So there was a whole series of these things. And I was being attacked left, right, and centre by people who, you know, had persuaded me in the past that they were interested in justice and fairness. And I couldn't understand this. So I started following all these trails. And I find now that actually, unwittingly, I had been, as it were, over the target all the time, even though I didn't even know there was a target. And the target was this culture Marxist program, which is now reaching its crescendo in terms of the penetration of Western civilization. I used the term earlier, constitutionalism, and to respond to I suppose identify, you know, one aspect of what we would, those of us on this side of the line, were interested in protecting. That was certainly a clear way of seeing, because in 2012 there was the children referendum, and that was really a rights grab from the parents, and then we had the attack on marriage and parenting and family in 2015, and the attack on the child in the womb in 2018, and all of those things. But they were part of a similar an attack on the Bill of Rights within the Irish Constitution, which is Article 40 to 44. But there's another word which I think is the partner of constitutionalism, that is civilizationalism. That what we are doing, we are defending Western civilization from an attack from within and without.
Yes.
And in fact, in some ways, the attack from within is actually worse than the threat from without. Although the threat from without is opportunistic and waiting for, you know, the damage, the inside elements, to do their worst and then take advantage of it. And that's already happening. We can see that with the, you know, China lurking, you know, menacingly in the background, and so on. And so constitutionalism and civilizationalism, they're, you know, that's what we are. You know, this idea that we're the far right, you know, this absolute gibberish that journalists out, like, and the Garda Commission, these idiots, like, we are constitutionalists and civilizationalists. That's what we are. I'm not either right or left.
Yes.
I'm not a conservative. I'm not a traditionalist. I'm not a radical. I'm not a liberal. I'm not a progressive. I'm a constitutionalist and a civilizationalist.
Okay, John. Well, I'm conscious now, very much conscious of your time, and maybe that might be a good place to finish things off.
Okay,
Do you
thanks.
think?
Thank you very much, Paul. Very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, lovely. I sincerely apologize. We had a bit of a technical issue at the start. It kind of threw me a bit at the beginning, but look,
Well, that's what
we
things
we
work.
got
It gives a sense that we're actually just clinging on to we're getting our message out by the skin of our teeth.
exactly. Yeah,
It's always a
exactly.
good way to be. It's a good feeling.
Yeah. So I'll just say goodbye to the audience there. Look, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the stream, and we'll see you next time. Okay. Take care. God bless. Bye bye.